Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Mary Julian, one of the curators of our exhibition, We Demand Women's Suffrage in Virginia, which opened earlier this year as part of the library's centennial celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women's voting rights. Since the gallery is currently closed, we wanted to bring some parts of the exhibition to you. It's hard to believe today, but a century ago, many women disagreed about whether they should have the right to vote. Suffragists not only had to convince men, but also other women that voting was a right of citizenship. In 1912, after the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia had started establishing local leagues around the state, a group of women and men in Richmond organized the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. In less than 2 years, it had grown to about 2,000 members. The association's first president was Jane Mead Rutherford. She had previously been president of the Women's Club of Richmond, which was one of the preeminent cultural organizations in the city. Rutherford had worked to expand educational and employment opportunities for women, but that didn't mean that she thought women needed the right to vote. She commented in a local newspaper that agitation for suffrage had, quote, done much to unsettle the thought and opinion that prevailed upon our women. It has introduced politics, party spirit, jealousy, and uncharitableness where none before existed. Politics was considered by many to be a dirty business, and that women would debase themselves by taking part in it. As the Virginia Association argued in one of its leaflets, women cannot have the franchise without going into politics, and the political woman will be a menace to society, to the home, and to the state. Being outside of politics gave women, quote, purity of thought and action, and thus they were better able to influence men as the embodiment of all that is good. Like the suffragists, the antis, as they were generally known, printed and distributed leaflets and pamphlets to share their arguments widely. The Virginia Association established its headquarters in Richmond and began providing free literature at local bookstores. It even sent out women around the state to speak against suffrage, just as the suffragists were doing in support of votes for women. Despite conducting a public campaign against the vote, anti-suffragists feared that suffrage activism threatened traditional gender roles. Many argued that it would lead to socialism and that the movement was anti-Christian, anti-family, and anti-marriage. Arguments that may sound familiar because they were used again by opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment decades later. Anti-suffragists claimed that the majority of women did not want the responsibility of voting, which they deemed a privilege rather than a right. While both groups emphasized the importance of women in the domestic sphere, they had different ideas about the effects of voting on women. Antis argued that women didn't have time to vote because it would keep them from their household duties, or if they spent their time on politics, then the men would have to do the household work. Suffragists, however, insisted that the franchise was essential to enact legislation benefiting women, children, and families. Racial discrimination was a significant component of opposition to women's voting rights in Virginia. Anti-suffragists repeatedly raised the argument that women's suffrage would bring African American women to the ballot box and would therefore threaten white supremacy in the state. Suffragists countered by pointing out that Virginia's Constitution effectively disfranchised African American men and would do the same to African American women, all of which served to sideline African American women in the fight for suffrage in Virginia. After the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, tens of thousands of Virginia women, white and black, registered to vote. Even some anti-suffragists registered. Mary Anderson Williams, then president of the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, urged her members to register in September 1920 to offset the votes of African American women and to, quote, oppose any radical or dangerous changes which may be proposed by agitators. 5 of the association's leaders registered to vote. While Vice President Margaret Wilmer did not do so, her 22-year-old daughter did, which may have led to some interesting family discussions. Mary Williams didn't take her own advice in 1920, but she did register to vote in January 1921. Even though in 2020 we may take the right to vote for granted, women won that right through a hard-fought campaign that took decades. But still today, not all Americans are able to easily and freely exercise that right, especially in communities of color where the fight continues. When the library is open again, I hope you'll visit our exhibition and get to see these pieces of history for yourself. In the meantime, you can learn more about the campaign for women's suffrage at our website, edu.lva.virginia.gov/wedemand. Thanks for joining us.